G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle, and today we're going to talk about the Thramas Crusade. The Thramas Crusade was a 3-year-long campaign beginning in the 7th year of Millennia 31, the 2nd year of the Horus Heresy, and it was designed to prevent the full and imposing strength of the Dark Angels Legion from interfering with Horus's drive towards Terra. To this end, Horus dispatched Conrad Kurz and the Night Lord's Legion, whose barbaric Terra tactics could suppress and pin down the region long enough to enact the Ruin Storm. The Night Lords were oddly well suited to this task. Being too unreliable to utilise in other areas of the conflict, Horus instead was happy to sacrifice a patch of the eastern fringes. Here he let Conrad enact his cruelties out of Horus's way, where he wouldn't impede the true traitor advance. Also, due to their indirect tactics, the Night Lords are much harder to pin down than other legions, such as the Iron Warriors or the Death Guard, who would have met the Dark Angels in direct battle and fallen prey to their savage Archaeotech weapons. Due to the line being distracted by fighting in the Ghoul Stars, east of the Milky Way proper, the Night Lords had well over a year to begin their conquest and digging like parasites into their unwilling hosts. The first world taken by the Night Lords was Sargualsa. Sargualsa was a barren world. It was once home to mining facilities which were systematically purged, the survivors being sent to the slave pits and tortured for sport by the Night Lords. Kurz chose to establish this sector stronghold on this world, and the dead bodies of Dark Angels were grafted into the very walls of the fortress, like decaying and nightmarish gargoyles. Sargualsa is the key link in the chain between Nostromo and the Thramas sector, and is the default home of the 8th Legion after they destroyed their home world. Rak is amongst the planets on the Tithe Road. It only bears mentioning here because it's an example of the Night Lord's terror tactics, taking a tithe of human children to enlist into their legion in exchange for their protection, like a mafia crime family. The world of Shell 3 fell next. However, infighting amongst rival Night Lords warbands saw a civil war of sorts break out amongst the Night Lords, where rivals the Dark Eyes battled the Boneless. After Shale, the Forge World of Gulgarhad was the next target. However, the world refused to surrender and unleashed their full might against the Night Lords whilst trying to summon loyalist assistance. At the same time as the attack on this minor Forge World, the next major strike was towards Thramas itself. Thramas was called the Jewel of the East. It was a hive world, nearing the Ghoul Stars. A fortress world, it was a launching point for many of the ventures into the void outside of the Milky Way, against forces like the Crave, and even the Emperor himself had visited the world once upon a time. The 8th Legion took the planet by deception, not for its wealth of arms, but due to the massive hive population, which were uniquely suited to Legion induction. They were so suited that over the course of the Great Crusade, they had actually supplied 4 separate legions with recruits. On Thramas, the Night Lord commander Nakrid Thol expected an easy surrender. However, the Imperial commander drew his pistol and fired it directly into Thol's face when asked to surrender. The wounded Thol was dragged back to his fleet, which bombarded the hive world with virus bombs in anger. However, the defenders survived within the sealed hive cities and fiercely resisted the Night Lords. After this, the world engaged in a defiant stand against the Night Lords. However, due to their subterfuge, the arrival of Kurz himself, the world eventually fell into traitor hands. Several worlds which were about to collapse instead chose to plant Phosphex charges and immolate themselves, knowing the fate that would befall them if they fell to Kurz. The Crucible was targeted in the next round of attacks. Crucible isn't just a planet, but is a patch of the Triplex sector which is full of black holes. The area is almost impossible to travel through due to the dozen or so singularities affecting both the material and the immaterium. The renegade forces of Triplex Fel host a research station in the area devoted to the creation of exotic particle weaponry or void weapons. Night households under the command of Maud and his Solar Auxilia managed to hold out for 6 months by conscripting and arming every single citizen of the planet. Amongst the key conquests of the Night Lords in this time was the turning of the entire Triplex sector and Triplex itself. Triplex is a series of Forge worlds who supplied the Imperial Fists in the lead up to the heresy, the primary world being the planet of Triplex Fel, and the ancillary forges were located upon the 2 moons of Galatia and Thule. Thule held an intense rivalry with the other worlds, and upon finding out that the other worlds had aligned themselves with the War Master, Thule sided with the Imperium out of pure spite. The resulting war was incredibly brutal, including constant scrap code attacks and culminating with the deployment of orbital bombs dropped from one planet towards another, and Titans of Legio Victorum being deployed against Thule. Now, the Lion. In the 8th year of Millennia 31, the Thramas and Triplex sectors were almost fully within the sphere of Night Lord's control. It was at this point that the Dark Angels arrived. Responding to loyalist pleas from worlds like Gulgarad, Triplex Thule, and Thramas, among others. Over the world of Triplex Galatia, 18 capital ships and over 100 escorts, a large fleet in 40k, equivalent to multiple chapters, but in the time of the Horus Heresy, this was but a fraction of what a legion could bring to bear. The Mechanicum and the Trader Navy vessels were quickly swept from the system, and the attack switched focus from the world directly to the Night Lord's heavy cruisers and frigates in the orbital area, which were forced to rapidly withdraw. In a display of their near-surgical precision, the Dark Angels directly under the command of the Lion used lancefire to disable a Night Lord's cruiser, the Shadow of Justice, before the Lion led his Dreadwing destroyer companies personally in an assault action against that warship. During the decisive assault, the Night Lord's captain commanding the vessel was captured and subjected to interrogation by the Dark Angels, who themselves excelled in tortures the likes of which even the Night Lords hadn't thought up. Cracking under the strain, the captain revealed to the Lion that several hundred smaller vessels were laying low in the system, waiting for an opportunity to strike the Loyalist. So the Lion acted swiftly, bringing in a further 100 capital warships and scouring the system of all trader vessels. After the Night Lords fled the system and abandoned their allies, the forces of Triplex Galatia thought they could withstand the Dark Angel's siege. However, the Lion sent in the Deathwing, who forged a landing zone, whereupon the Dreadwing landed in their full numbers, led by Eschaton Marduk Cedras. The Dark Mechanicum then unleashed the full horrors of their engineered monstrosities against the Dark Angels, only for the Lion to deploy his own automata, the Exindio class, against them. Sweeping the field clear, the Lion himself led the assault until faced down by a Proto-Defiler, which held up the Dark Angels until the Lion himself faced it down and personally destroyed it. After annihilating the forces of the Forge World, the Dark Angels systematically set about purging the world room by room with phosphex rather than wasting lives in costly assaults. Word of the crushing of Galatia caused the traitor forces on Triplex Fel to flee, and the world was swiftly handed over to the Dark Angels and the system was secured for the Loyalist cause, albeit in a severely reduced capacity due to the destruction wrought by the Legion. Next, the Lion moved on Shoal and Yaelis, where the Night Lords used human conscripts and slaves to slow the Dark Angels' advance, whilst harassing them with guerrilla strikes and delaying actions. This action slowed the Loyalist assault, and it took some time before the Lion could muster enough strength to retake Crucible. Upon arriving, the battered survivors under Maud still held out and joined forces with the Dark Angels to repel the Night Lords. The Lion now opted to open up multiple fronts simultaneously in order to try and rapidly retake as much space as possible, lest the traitors entrench themselves too deep. However, this strategy thinned his forces. It was difficult to muster enough strength to make further conquests and hold on to those already reclaimed. This problem was only further heightened as forces under Sevatar and Anrek Barbatos began to call in their dark allies, forces loyal to Conrad Kurz and hidden by him during the Great Crusade, such as the cannibal legions of Glabro and the Forge world of Ulan Hudar, a rogue Forge planet. Ulan Hudar is an interesting Forge world, a relic from the Dark Age of technology, where in order to survive the ravages of the Old Night, the Magos of the world used Xenos technology to allow the world to travel the warp itself, appearing in orbit above the other worlds only to fire upon them and harvest them for its own selfish survival. The world had committed such crimes that the Imperium certainly would have purged them. However, the Night Lords, who found the world, instead hid it, and in trade received many dark and terrifying weapons. Ulan Hudar wasn't destroyed by the Lion's forces during the Crusade, and the world survived, again turning to a nomadic existence, only reappearing to devour the life and materials of other worlds over the coming millennia. Now, the counterattack. With fresh reinforcements, the mauled and understrength Night Lords were able to take the assault back against the Loyalists, attacking at Crucible, Yarduk, and Chenro 9, where the Night Lords wagered how long it would take the Dark Angels to kill all the conscripts sent to attack them, whilst they stood back and observed the Dark Angels' deployments. The Dark Angels skillfully used their own conscripts to defend off many of the assaults, lulling the Night Lords into a false sense of security by making their numbers seem fewer than they actually were. It was at this point that Conrad Kurz began to assemble his full legion might for a counter-assault. Nakrid Thol, fixated on Thramas, was the only commander not to assemble his forces, but the Night Haunter was still able to deploy over 100,000 Astartes for his planned assault. On Chenro, the Dark Angels, who were outnumbered 3-1, called in danger close orbital strikes on their own positions in order to repel the thousands of Night Lords arrayed against them. But by far, the largest assault was targeted at Crucible, with over 50,000 conscripts, 12,000 Astartes, a Legio Victorium Sub-Legio, and the Primarch himself leading them. In the void above the planet, the Dark Angels fleet, which was led by 2 Glorianas, savaged the Night Lords, who committed to a massive drop assault upon Crucible. As the forces of Victorium drove against the Dark Angels' main lines, the conscripts were gunned down in waves by the defenders, but a crazed Conrad Kurz broke off from this assault, and snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, he instead caused carnage wherever he went, but failed to break the defensive cordon with the haphazard assault. The Dark Angels then staged an orderly withdrawal to other defensive positions, whilst the Titans were picked off one by one by the Ordinatus engines of Crucible. At the same time as Kurz was devastating the defensive positions, he was then ambushed by Exindio-class battle automata, and whilst incapable of finishing him, they nevertheless caused him grievous harm and pinned him in place. The Night Lords commanders across the battlefield, who had gathered and planning how they would divide the spoils of war, were actually ambushed now by the Lion and his Deathwing companions, who, after killing them all, threw the Night Lords into disorganised chaos without any leadership there to corral them. Kurz was dragged from the battlefield, as the Night Lords fell back in disarray, screaming for the Lion to face him in battle. Over 9,000 of the 12,000 Night Lords committed to the assault had perished, and this battle alone cost the Night Lords 10% of their entire Legion's strength, as it stood at the beginning of the counterattack into Dark Angels' controlled space. This opened the window for the Dark Angels to attack in multiple sectors, with Yardak, Vestrum, and Thramas all coming under direct assault. Kurz retreated to Sarguelsa, and the Lion began to build up his strength for a major push on Thramas itself. Prior to the attack on Thramas, the Lion managed to scrape together over 1,000 Deathwing companions, and was accompanied by a cadre of White Scar's legionnaires, who had been tricked into supporting the Night Lords, only realising the error of their ways when witnessing the atrocities the Night Lords committed. When they arrived at Thramas, the Lion's flagship, the Gloriana-class warship Invincible Reason, led the assault. However, upon arriving in the system, they encountered the rogue forge world of Ulan Huda. As a quick note, Imperial warp technology is limited in where it can be safely activated, with transition points usually far to the edge of solar systems. For example, ships visiting Terra would transition to the warp out beyond Pluto and arrive there as well, which is why the entire planetary system requires fortification, lest the enemy translate anywhere within that massive range. If one was to appear within a system, the chances of translating into real space inside of terrestrial objects is simply too great. You don't want to teleport your ship directly inside a planet. Now, in the skies above Thramas, Ulan Huda had set to work, slowly immolating and devouring Thramas of all life and technology, literally lifting cities into the sky and consuming them as they broke apart in the gravity well. It was against this rogue planet that the Lion threw his forces, fighting against Dark Mechanicum constructs such as Flesh Drones, Lachrymosian Thralls, and Defiler engines. Meanwhile, overhead, the Dark Angels fleet punished Nakrid Thol's forces, as well as pummeling the defences of Ulan Huda. The Lion led an assault deep into the heart of the planetoid with the goal of killing the Dark Magos leading the world, a being known as the Witch of Thramas. This being was merely organs contained within a spherical shell, surrounded by hordes of minions, both thrall and construct. The Lion had to personally end the Witch, as the dreadnoughts of the First Legion turned out to be incapable of harming the Magos. It was at this point that the force of White Scars discovered the main power generators of the world, the ones that powered the shields, and after notifying the Dark Angels to evacuate, they chose to sacrifice their lives in a kamikaze attack to destroy the generators. With the world now exposed and shieldless, rendered almost inert thanks to the loss of their generators, and at the mercy of the Dark Angels' fleet, the Dark Forge world retreated back through the warp to rebuild and return to haunt the Imperium another day. Now, Sarguelsa. With Thramas returned to loyalist hands, it was now time to strike towards Sarguelsa. The wounded but not yet defeated Night Lords made minor gains, retaking Yaelis and threatening supply routes with hit-and-run attacks. But on Sarguelsa, Conrad summoned the remaining embers of his loyal captains, and issued a challenge to the Lion to meet him on the Blighted World. The Lion for his part accepted, and each taking 2 champions, for the Dark Angels Alejos and Causeway, and for the Night Lords Sevatar and Sheng. Curze shared his visions of the fallen and the destruction of Caliban with the Lion, who after being insulted struck the first blow through Conrad's stomach with his sword. Conrad then proceeded to lunge at his brother, and the two ended up in a brawl on the ground. Meanwhile, the 4 champions duelled amongst the rocks, with Alejos sacrificing his life to buy Causeway in time to save the Lion. And save him he did, with Curze gaining the upper hand in the fistfight. The Lion, being unarmed, was at the mercy of Conrad's clawed hands, both being strangled and his throat punctured at the same time. It was into this fight that Causeway threw himself, driving his power sword through Conrad's spine. The 2 gravely injured Primarchs had to be dragged from the battlefield as their legions both descended upon the theatre, with Causeway being asked where he left his sword, to which he simply replied, in Curze's spine. The battle was disorganised, with forces driven by aggression rather than a grand plan, but the discipline of the Dark Angels won through, with the Night Lords ultimately fleeing the fight. The Lion then consolidated his forces, and, after leaving the area to seek Tuchalcha on Perditus, the remaining Night Lords saw an opportunity to win further gains. Thol now attacked his hated Thramas again. This time he conquered most of the world before Marduk Cedrus arrived to reclaim the world. Thol, with 10,000 Night Lords at his disposal, figured on a long defence against the Dark Angels. However, unfortunately for him, Marduk Cedrus was having none of it, and did the most rational move made so far in the Horus Heresy. He simply looked upon the ruined world, and correctly predicting the fallout would be minimal, given the damage the world had already sustained, he simply phosphex bombarded all the positions of the Night Lords from orbit, and then launched his ground assault against the few surviving Night Lords, personally killing Thol. Now, after Perditus. So I briefly mentioned Perditus earlier, and Tuchalcha, and I shall go into more detail now. Spoilers if you haven't read the Horus Heresy series. I briefly mentioned Perditus and Tuchalcha. Tuchalcha was a sentient warp device, one of several which when used together were able to create the webway itself. Tuchalcha was alone, and he was captured by the Imperium during the Great Crusade and sent to Perditus for study. But when the Lion arrived, he found the Death Guard under Callus Typhon fighting Iron Hands for the prize. The Lion naturally took Tuchalcha for himself, and along with several massive Ordinatus engines, which he later gifted to Perturabo, not realising Perturabo had already turned traitor, one of the Lion's gravest errors. Tuchalcha was able to sense entities within the warp, and within the Materium, such as humans, and because of this he was able to direct navigators directly to those points in space. By utilising Tuchalcha, the Lion thus gained something the Imperium had up until this point lacked, a reliable way to navigate the warp to exactly where one intended. With this ability now unlocked, the Lion then intentionally created a gap in the Loyalist lines by providing the Forge World of Gulgrahad with intelligence on their hated foe Legio Victorium. When the Forge World moved their military assets to attack, the Night Lords would seek to exploit this perceived weakness. With Shelb now being lightly defended, the Dark Angels mustered a fleet of well over 300 capital ships, the equivalent of over 30 Space Marine chapters in 40k. The Night Lords fleet numbered over 200 capital grade vessels and 600 escorts and support craft, the bulk of their surviving strength, and they plunged mercilessly into the gap in the Loyalist lines. Here the Lion played his hand, and Tuchalcha was able to direct the Dark Angels fleet not just to the Night Lords, was able to allow them directly to translate into real space amongst the Night Lord ships. To the Night Lords, the Dark Angels appeared seemingly from nowhere, shields raised and weapons ready to fire, and within seconds of translating, the Dark Angels fired upon the Night Lords, who were simply too stunned by the sudden appearance of the war fleet. Dozens of ships were destroyed within the first few seconds of the melee, and the Dark Angels barely received a scratch in return. The Night Lords now turned about after the first pass, and drove a wedge of almost 100 ships directly back into the Dark Angels' lines, but the disciplined fire of the ready First Legion destroyed more than half of the vessels before they had closed this gap. At this point, sensing the battle lost, the Night Lords began to flee and were mercilessly pursued and hunted down. The Lion himself led his forces directly at the Nightfall, the Gloriana-class flagship of the Night Lords. Curze, meanwhile, was on the ground fighting below, when the Loyalists began to descend upon him. Of the 40,000 Night Lords who remained alive at this point in the heresy, over a quarter would die at this battle. The Lion, not repeating his earlier mistake of brawling with curs, instead dispatched him with clinical precision, cutting him down and rendering him comatose before being forced to fall back as the Night Lords retrieved their fallen Primarch. The Night Lord's Legion was now in full flight. Sevatar chose to deal with the captains who dissented against him at this point by purging their ranks and making him the de facto leader of the Night Lords. He tried to rebuild the Legion and regroup at Katesh, but once more the Dark Angels fell directly upon them thanks to Tuatolcha. The Night Lords led a desperate boarding action against the Invincible Reason, flagship of the Dark Angels. With Sevatar and the Atramentar trying to assassinate the Lion, they were soon joined by the now conscious Curs. However, they were surrounded and cut down, and the survivors, Sevatar amongst them, were captured and imprisoned, whilst Curs slunk away into the bowels of the great ship, evading the Lion's wrath. At this point, the Night Lord's Legion was utterly shattered. Of the over 100,000 Marines who had started the Thramas Crusade, barely 15,000 members were left alive, and the twin beatings they took at Shale and Katesh had savaged them. The Legion had barely 20% of the troops they had had when they'd started the Thramas Crusade, and even legions which had fought at Istvan V in the Drop Site Massacre, such as the Iron Hands, were now superior in men and equipment to the ravaged Night Lords. Thramas, Triplex, and Shoal all lay shattered, the vast industries and populations decimated by the war. But the sectors were now dominated by the Loyalists, and a regular influx of troops and provisions began to make their way to the Dark Angels, who set about tasking the survivors to rebuild. The Lion was somewhat depressed by the Pyrrhic victory, however he had made up his mind to seek out Rabude Gilliman of the Ultramarines, who he rightly figured would be distracted by his own war against the Shadow Crusade of Lorgar and Angron. He thus went west to Macragge. Meanwhile, the surviving Night Lords scattered like rats, with the most powerful choosing to return to Sarguelsa and renew their residency at the Dark Fortress. Few Night Lords would participate in the heresy from this point until the siege. So ended the Thramas Crusade. There you go, that's the Thramas Crusade. I hope I've laid this out in an interesting way and explained the full campaign to you. The problem with many of these books is that campaigns are kind of hard to follow for some people. The maps are rather vague, planets are named but not written out on them. The order in which things attack can be a bit confusing, so I've tried to lay it out in a way that anyone can understand if they come across this video. If you like this style, please let me know. I would like to make more videos like this. Perhaps the Shadow Crusade would be a good one to do next. Anyway, I'm Mac with the Outer Circle. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.